a number of you already know Stephanie. And Stephanie Beckman was a board member on the UNA-Dane committee and was selected as a CSW66 delegate. She is interested in gender equality and women's empowerment. And she's currently a full-time faculty at Madison College and a PhD student in international psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Her research involves organizational inputs on community peace and healing in Bogota, Colombia. She also serves as APA's Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict and Violence, and Director of Student and Early Career Membership. Yeater Rathbun, who is maybe watching us, is on the board of UNA-Dane and is the immediate past president of the chapter. She served as president for 3 years, and she has assumed leadership to bring the Madison City Council to adopt a resolution affirming the city's commitments to the principles of the UN's Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And she also was selected to be a delegate. She was a delegate last year to the meeting that unfortunately was canceled. Mary is a longtime advocate of gender equity and women's empowerment. She taught at the university level in women's history course in 1975, so it was a pioneer of that. And she was a research assistant on the first biographical dictionary of American women that was published in 1971. So we have two very distinguished speakers putting this together, and it's an honor to have been selected as a delegate to this conference. And I will hand it over to Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Linda, and thanks everyone for being here. It's nice to see you all. As Linda said, it's really unfortunate that Mary's not here because she is just such a wealth of information when it comes to women's history and women's empowerment. Luckily for me, and luckily for us all, she's also very organized, and I have all of her speaking notes. So you're not really gonna get shortchanged. You won't get to have her personality and her sense of humor, unfortunately, but you'll at least get to have the knowledge that she put together for us. So I will apologize that I'll probably be doing some reading simply because I have just a fraction of the knowledge that she has, and I wanna make sure that I'm getting the details correct. So, so she is with us, even if she's not physically with us. I will move us forward. So basically, the goals for our talk tonight are to define CSW, in case any of you who are here are not familiar with CSW, and actually to go over a pretty detailed history on the Commission on the Status of Women. We're also going to talk about this year's specific CSW66 and its priority theme and review theme. We're going to go into what the types of sessions are. There are actually 3 different types of sessions, so we'll talk about those. And then we'll talk about what our role is, like what we're actually doing there and kind of why we're there. And I'm going to give you an insider view of the experience. And I think the part that's going to be really lacking the most are those takeaways, because I can share from my perspective what excited me and what I took away, but I'm sure that, you know, Mary had her own set of specifics that she took away from the experience as well. So those of you who actually know her and are connected to her, I do encourage you to connect with her and to pick her brain on this, because you know, she definitely brings a different lens than I do. And then we're going to sort of conclude with what does this all mean for the UNA-Dane County chapter, and looking forward to CSW67, when hopefully some of you will also apply and be selected as delegates. and then with whatever time we have left, some Q&A. So to answer this important question, what is the Commission on the Status of Women? And the aside from United Nations alphabet soup is definitely Mary's sense of humor. And you'll find as we go, there's just so many acronyms. So if it gets confusing, you're not alone. But the Commission on the Status of Women is an organization that was put together by the United Nations. So even though Mary has been involved in women's issues pretty much since the beginning of women's empowerment movement, she commented in her notes that she wasn't even aware of what CSW was until recently. So, I mean, there's just so much going on. United Nations is so huge that it's just not possible to be on top of every single thing that they're doing. So thanks to her involvement with the United Nations Association of Dane County over the course of 15 years, and thanks to her work with UNA National, she, now has become aware of Commission on the Status of Women. And as a result, we're able to have, she's been able to be a delegate a couple of times, and we'll learn more about that later. So the history of this commission, so the United Nations Economic and Social Council, which is one of its 6 principal organs, is commonly referred to as EcoSoc. And if I'm saying that wrong and anyone knows better, call me out on it, but I'm guessing it's pronounced EcoSoc, ECOSOC. That was established in 1946, thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, and Hillary Clinton has also done some women's rights championing in her role as First Lady, especially at the CSW Beijing in 1995. CSW is the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women. So this is like the overarching umbrella of the UN in terms of all things women's empowerment and women's rights. It met for the first time in 1947 and has met once a year, just about every year since then. There have been a couple of exceptions. The 54 member states of EcoSoc elect 45 member states from within their numbers to serve on CSW. So it's not necessarily that every single member state is involved in this process. But there are some parameters. It's not just any 45 states. It must include 13 states from Africa, 11 from Asia, 9 from Latin America and the Caribbean, 8 from Western Europe and other states, including United States, and 4 from Eastern Europe. So that's really intentional to make sure that it's not a completely Western dominated commission. So each of the 45 states gets 1 representative who serves a 4-year term. And these terms are staggered so that it's not a big turnover all at one time. The 45 representatives on CSW meet annually to evaluate programs in gender equality, identify challenges, and set global standards and formulate concrete policies to promote gender equality and advancement of women worldwide. So these meetings are called sessions. These annual meetings are sessions. So this was session 66, thus CSW66. So in the early years, this commission was mostly focused on gathering data. I mean, especially since it was early, like they needed to know what they were working with in terms of the inequalities and the situation of women. The General Assembly of the United Nations charged the Commission on the Status of Women with drafting the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. In 1967, the General Assembly adopted CSW's draft. So that's a really foundational document in terms of women's rights. But its impact on the ground was limited. And we see that today. We're still at CSW66 having inequalities in our world. So this led to the perception that a legally binding convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women was needed. So that's, you might recognize that as one of those alphabet soup things, CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So in 1979, CEDAW went into effect in those nations and was ratified in 1981. Disappointingly, the United States has not ratified CEDAW. The United States is actually the only state that has signed but not ratified CEDAW. And the only other governments globally that have not ratified CEDAW are Iran, Palau, Somalia, Sudan, and Tonga. So we're one of a very small number of states that haven't actually adopted CEDAW, which is, I don't even know how to describe it. Besides, I mean, it's disappointing, but I have stronger reactions to that. Once CSW drafted CEDAW, the CSW turned to other business. So for its 25th year, it called its first Conference of Women in 1975. 133 governments participated with 6,000 representatives of NGOs in a parallel forum. The conference defined a world plan of action, and from then, a major function of the CSW sessions has been assessing programs in achieving its most current plan of action. So this is where they started to branch out beyond the UN to include these other organizations in terms of accomplishing these really important tasks. CSW convened a second World Conference in 1980 with 145 nations and 8,000 participants from 187 countries. The third World Conference in 1985 had 157 member states. I'm losing my place here. With 12,000 participants. And you can see that every year it's growing and growing with more and more participation. One of the greatest achievements of the Commission on the Status of Women in its 76-year history was the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing, which significantly advanced the global agenda for women's human rights and gender equality. And that's the one that was mentioned before that involved Hillary Clinton. The Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, adopted unanimously by 189 countries, built on political agreements reached at the 3 previous global conferences on women, and consolidated 5 decades of legal advances aimed at securing the equality of women and with men in law and in practice. The Intergovernmental Meeting in Beijing and the related NGO forum was the largest gathering of government, NGO, and media representatives ever held for a UN conference. Participants in the Intergovernmental Conference numbered 17,000, including 6,000 delegates from 189 governments, more than 4,000 accredited NGO representatives, and about 4,000 journalists and media representatives. 30,000 NGO activists attended the parallel forum in 1995. In 1996, EcoSoc expanded CSW's mandate and decided it should take a leading role in monitoring and reviewing the progress and problems in implementing the Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action, and in mainstreaming a gender perspective in UN activities. So this mandate is still in effect 25 years later, and every year since 1996, every annual CSW session has had a priority theme based on the Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action. So in terms of CSW66, you can see that we had a priority theme and a review theme. So the priority theme this year was achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So a really important intersection of environmental issues and women's issues. Each CSW also has a review theme. And this year's review theme was women's economic empowerment and the changing world of work. So this review theme is from 5 years ago, from CSW61. So also, since the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action, CSW member states have started to include and adopt aspects of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, this agenda provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity and the planet, now and into the future. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you might know them as SDGs, which are urgent calls for action by all countries, developed and developing in global partnership. The 2 SDGs that were focused on for CSW66 were SDG 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, and SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So you might have some questions about what are these CSW sessions actually like. So there are three main types of sessions. There are the official plenaries, which involve the government sent officials. So these are either ambassadors or in this case, people who are sent, maybe not as ambassadors, but specifically as representatives of a particular government's women's rights programming. These include ministerial roundtables, general discussions, and interactive dialogues. There are also side events. These side events are promoted by the United Nations, and they're usually partnerships of governments and particular organizations. Sometimes they're government officials, sometimes they're NGOs. It's kind of a combination. And then parallel events are things that are happening along the side of CSW, but they're not actually put on by the UN. They're kind of put on in support of the UN, but the UN doesn't have any sort of oversight over those particular parallel events. So here are some example titles to give you an idea of the different flavors of these things. So you'll see that they get more exciting as we go. So for example, some of the plenary titles include Commission on the Status of Women, 66th session, opening of the session, general discussion, first plenary meeting. So not too exciting, doesn't really tell us what we're gonna be talking about. And what you'll find with these plenaries is they're really prepared statements by governments. There's not really any discussion, even if it says discussion, even if it's a roundtable, you're not really seeing people play off of each other. It's literally somebody from a government showing up with a scripted statement that's been kind of stamped with approval from their governments. So while it's really important information in terms of giving us the direction of particular governments with their women's programming, it's also one of those things that's crafted in such a way to cast those governments in as positive of a light as possible. So what's interesting is you hear from countries that have a track record of issues with women, with women's empowerment, but they're putting out these statements that make things look like it's all rosy and wonderful. So it's kind of interesting with that. Here are some examples of side events. So these are the ones that are still kind of overseen or sanctioned by the United Nations, some involvement from the United Nations, but not necessarily as specific to government officials. They might have some. So for instance, women's and girls' empowerment, key to equitable food systems and a changing climate, tackling modern slavery and human trafficking, the importance of financial inclusion of women and girls, building private sector resiliency to market disruptions with a focus on West African traders, the forgotten voices, the impact of climate change on violence against women, shameful contrast, inequality at the intersection of age and gender, and the list goes on. You can see that some of them are offered in other languages. We have Spanish, some of them might be in other languages. And actually, all of these are offered in whatever language the presenters, in particular the plenaries, but these ones too, in whatever language the speaker speaks. There's always live translation. So that's a really great option. I don't know how many languages they offer, but there are many different languages. So you can see that these are a lot more interesting, a lot more specific, and a little bit more, it gives you more of an idea of some of the specific projects or specific tasks that these countries or collaborations are focusing on. So the final type are these parallel events. So the parallel events, again, are put on usually by nonprofits, sometimes in partnership with governments or with other entities, but by and large, they are outside of the scope of the United Nations, but in support of United Nations work with the CSW. So you can see here, for example, addressing the impact of forever chemicals on girls and women. This was one that was actually put on by UNA USA. Institutional racism, LGBTQ+, sexual and reproductive health and rights, African Dance Party, feminist and youth movements and leadership, women in migration, women, peace, power, women photographers as peace builders. So clearly these are a little bit even more exciting and engaging than some of the ones we saw before. So I know that when Mary attended last year, she attended, I don't remember, she told me it was like dozens of sessions over the course of the couple of weeks. And she said that she really enjoyed the parallel sessions because they were much more interactive. You actually got to go into breakout rooms. You got to take away people's email addresses or LinkedIn information, and maybe even follow up with people after the fact or hear some of the great work that attendees and presenters were doing. And you'll find out a little bit more about what it feels like to be in these sessions. But yeah, they go from kind of in levels from like stuffiest to least stuffy as we get to the parallel events. So in terms of delegates, these are all actually delegates from United Nations Association that attended, and there were more. These were just some examples. So in terms of delegation, in addition to the representatives of the 54 member states on EcoSoc, 5,593 NGOs have consultative status at the council. United Nations Association of the United States of America is one of these nearly 6,000 organizations that have that status. So that's why the United Nations Association is able to send delegates to CSW each year, because of that direct partnership with the United Nations and with the CSW. CSW has a close relationship with NGOs in consultative status with EcoSoc and invites them to participate in CSW's annual sessions as observers. So the national UNA USA has the same formal application process for selecting representatives each year, and presumably it'll be similar in years to come. So anyone who wants to become a delegate has to have the following criteria. You have to be a member of UNA USA or a member of one of those other organizations. So if any of you are parts of other organizations and you want to apply through those organizations, your organization would have its own process. You may not have been a delegate within the last 3 years. And there's an asterisk because Mary attended last year. So we're going to talk about how she got to go a little bit later. You have to be at least 18 years of age and agree to participate in at least 5 events. So every day, pretty much from early morning into the evening, there are events. So it's not really that difficult to attend 5 events, especially if you physically are there in person, as in years past. However, these days with the virtual meetings, you'll hear a little bit more from me about that later, about how that's slightly different. We have to write at least 1 blog post about our experiences that the UNA may or may not decide to publish. I believe they publish 2 examples. And then you have to write 2 essays basically explaining why you want to be a delegate and how you will benefit from the experience, or how your chapter will benefit from the experience. So and I have asterisks here too. The reason Mary wanted to make sure we talked about this is because she has a really strong interest, and I agree that it's a really great opportunity. And I think that the work that is happening globally is really aligned with a lot of the work that we're doing here at UNA-Dane. So we would encourage any of you to apply. Notice that there is no gender requirement. There are definitely men who are there, both at government levels all the way down to delegate levels. We need those voices as well. So in 2022, the United Nations Association of USA initially selected 20 delegates. So I was one of those initial 20 selected from however many applied nationwide. I think it was about like 150 people applied. So that was really lucky. But I think because United Nations Association Dane County has such a strong track record, especially with our Cities for CEDAW work, we're kind of on the national radar in terms of the stuff that we're doing, which is really exciting. But luckily for Mary, even though she attended last year, considering things, well, let me read what she said to make sure I get it right. So luckily for Mary, a month before CSW66 began, the Bureau of CSW, that is the representatives of the 5 CSW member states who organize and facilitate the sessions of the commission, enlarged the number of accredited delegates allowed from individual NGOs from 20 to 50. The Bureau did this because CSW66 was a virtual event. Larger numbers of people at virtual events don't mean anything unless they become too many for the meeting platform to accommodate. Accredited NGO delegate access to all the official meetings was through UN's web TV, and there's no limit to the number of people who can watch a TV show. So basically, it doesn't impact them in any way. Why not have more people there, more observers, more communication, more advocacy? It's a win for everyone involved. But you can imagine that, in an in-person event, that might not be sustainable. Accredited NGO delegates were entitled to observe all of the 15 official plenaries and the 213 side events that comprise the 66th session of CSW. All of the plenaries and 14 of the side events were televised on UN's web TV, and all were virtual events. The remaining side events were on a variety of platforms, including Zoom. But to register for them, you had to be an official representative of an NGO in consultative status with EcoSoc. So see if I want to add anything else from her comments here about that. So yeah, basically, the United Nations Association informed the people who did not get selected in the initial round that they were welcome then to join. And because of Mary's history of attending in the past and her ongoing support for women's empowerment work, she was then able to join as well. She writes here, I had assumed, given UNA USA's rules, that I could not even apply to attend CSW66 as a UNA USA delegate, but because of my continued leadership role in the chapter's women's rights initiatives, the officers and board of UNA-Dane urged me to apply anyhow and urged the national to include me in its delegation. When the number of allowable delegates enlarged, the national offered me a place and I took it. So it was wonderful to be able to have Mary there and to have her bring back that information. So as I mentioned before, the faces you see here are examples of the delegates who were there. One of the big takeaways is that we did get to have several kind of collaborative meetings with these folks. So there was a meeting before where you got to meet the delegates. There was an ongoing Slack channel where you're chatting throughout. There was a happy hour during CSW itself, and then there was a debrief at the end. So what was the experience like? Well, you can imagine you're in New York at the headquarters and you're walking up to the building and you have your guest badge and you get in and you get into the Grand Hall, which was just renovated in 2017. And you're there, you're seeing these flags from around the world and artwork from around the world. And it's, it takes your breath away to be in that kind of environment. But in a virtual world, that's not the experience we get. So up until the pandemic, that was the delegate experience. You're at UN headquarters, you're sitting in and observing diplomacy happening in action in real time. The reality is something more like this. So in the upper left corner, this is a screenshot from UN's TV channel. So if you just, I believe it's media.un.org. If you just Google like UN media, you can watch live recordings of the United Nations anytime that you want, and you can go back and watch recordings. And I was just like, I would watch that anyway. Like, I mean, maybe they're not all that exciting, but I mean, some of this stuff are things that, I mean, I think a lot of us are really passionate about. If you're a member of UNA USA, you might find that there are things that you are really interested in and would like to participate in. So that was a huge takeaway for me, is that they have a TV channel and you can stream it anytime you want. Over here in the top right is a screenshot from our Slack channel. So if you're not familiar with Slack, it's basically an online chat tool. It's a group of people who all have to sign up for the same group, and you're kind of chatting throughout. So people were using it as a way to share materials, to help each other get into things, to, kind of hype up the experience so you feel a little bit less isolated. These are some screenshots of different sessions. And then this one here in the bottom is kind of another screenshot of the UN TV. So you can sort of see what that looks like. So basically it was, a lot of screen time. For me, part of this I did while I was on vacation in Maine, and part of this I did during my normal work week. So I was kind of sneaking it in here and there as I went. So that's a benefit, that I didn't have to give up some of those things I would have otherwise done, but it certainly wasn't as immersive as being in New York. So a great experience nevertheless. So in terms of takeaways, I will read Mary's statement, and then I'll share a couple of my own highlights. So Mary writes, my biggest takeaway was how universal the awareness is of the fact that climate crisis and gender equality are inextricably linked. Spokespeople for all nations acknowledge this climate gender nexus, but I particularly loved US Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield's statement, the climate crisis is sexist. Another highlight for me was UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' reiteration of something I heard him say at CSW65. Gender parity is ultimately a matter of power, and patriarchy pushes back all over the world. It's nice to know that he, and thus the entire highest level administration at the UN, acknowledge this truth. In terms of reflections, I think creating such a young delegation was a great decision by the UNA-USA, not just for the sake of growing the UNA organization, which may be why the nation's administrators did it, but for the sake of empowerment of women, girls, and all those who identify as female or who have faced gender discrimination of any kind. It is time for the torch to be passed to fifth wave feminists. She says, I'm a dinosaur, which I don't agree. She's one of the most vibrant people I know, but anyway. I came of age during the second wave of feminism, a movement that started in the mid-1960s and was the thing until the 1980s. A feminism that was, as the third wave feminists in the 1990s made clear, all about white middle-class women. Third wave feminism made course corrections, as did the fourth wave feminists that came to the fore about 2012. But now it is time for a new generation to take the lead, and UNA-USA is helping to empower them to do that by making them representatives of a national organization on the world stage. In terms of trends, I hope to see youth involvement built on the climate gender nexus continue to expand. So for me, in terms of trends, I saw that gender analysis and data collection was still a really important thing. We commented before that back in the 1960s, when this was all kind of just getting up and running, it was a lot about data collection, but I still think that gender analysis is a really important thing, especially as things look more globally. If we don't know the disparities, then how do we know where to put resources? So that was one really big takeaway for me. Along the lines of what Mary said, I also noticed the youth movements. I think I've been very aware of youth climate movements. I haven't been as aware of youth gender movements, but it was great to see that intersection here and to see so many young people really excited and really passionate about this work from both angles, both gender and from climate. It was really also exciting to see such a variety of interprofessional collaborations. So, I mean, there were people who attend this from all different career paths, all different viewpoints in terms of, business and nonprofits and medical and environmental scientists and educators. I mean, it was just really exciting, legal people. And it was just really exciting to see so many people from different stances. I think that the complexities of gender inequality and the complexities of climate need people from all of these different skill areas. So I was glad to see that there was such broad representation. And I think for me, maybe the biggest takeaway is that the real leaders in this are developing countries. The United States and Europe, we like to pat ourselves on the back, like, oh, we got electric cars. But the people who are most impacted by this are people often in developing countries. And they're the ones, from my view, who are doing more with less and who are coming up with the most innovative partnerships and the most innovative solutions. So I was really impressed by that. And I feel like a lot of the kind of world powers need to learn from what they're doing, because I think that many of these countries are doing such a good job, especially with the climate stuff. But also, I mean, we know it's an intersection also with women's issues as well. So those were my trends. In terms of highlights, I was really excited to see LGBTQ representation at a variety of levels. I only heard it mentioned in one plenary, but I also only attended 3 or 4 of the 15 official plenaries. But to even have LGBT issues mentioned, I think is really important. I wasn't sure what to expect because much of the language says women and girls. And so I wasn't sure how inclusive that was of LGBTQ folks. And that was much more represented in terms of the side events and the parallel events. And then the other highlight for me was learning about women-led Indigenous cultures. There are many global cultures that have histories of, women as leaders, women as, matrilineal, I guess I should say, cultures. And so that was something that was an area of ignorance for me. And so it was really exciting to learn more about that. The sad part of it was that those countries have still been in more modern times impacted by patriarchal global things. But it was still really excited to learn that. I was still really excited to learn that history and to think about how those voices might be able to help lead in terms of righting some wrongs. In terms of surprises, I was surprised by how many countries sent men to be their official representatives. And I think what I learned from Mary, because I brought that up to her, she mentioned that the representatives are actually voted on by their countries. So for whatever that means or whatever that's worth, certainly, some countries might be more male driven anyway. I mean, clearly most of the people there were women, but it was interesting how many men. Concerns. I think the most disappointing part for me was in those official plenaries. I was disappointed at how canned the statements were. And I was disappointed by the lip service that a lot of countries who have just really glaring human rights and women's rights issues were like kind of singing their own praises. I think for me, and I think it's a cultural thing. I know many cultures have a kind of a face saving mentality, but I appreciate a little bit more authenticity and saying, hey, we don't have it all right, but here's what we're trying to do to make it better. But a lot of countries that, have a lot of work to do, I think were not really acknowledging that. So that was a concern for me, but that's my very American lens and stance. And in terms of reflections, it was just a really exciting and energizing and positive experience. I left with a lot of hope that there are literally thousands, and these are just the people who are represented like to be there, which means there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people who are doing this work around the world. I just felt really hopeful and I felt really empowered. So that was really my big reflection. So what else do we have? So what does this all mean for UNA-Dane? Mary and I go do this really cool thing. We come back to reality, daily life. What are we bringing back? Well, this is from Mary. So 2 of the 2021 and 2022 UNA-Dane initiatives relate directly to CSW66. For the past year, we've been actively working on building on the CEDAW resolution we got the Madison City Council to adopt on April 30th, 2019. In March 2021, the chapter began partnering with the 4W initiative at UW-Madison on this work. In June, Mary became a mentor to the first of 2 successive groups of students in 4W Director Lori DePreet Brown's classes, who were tasked with writing a CEDAW ordinance for Madison based on the template created by Cities for CEDAW, a national grassroots civil society campaign. A resolution is only a statement of a will from a legislative body. An ordinance is actually a law that can designate an existing body to oversee the implementation of CEDAW. An ordinance can provide funding to support the implementation of CEDAW. An ordinance can also require gender analysis of city operations, looking especially at departments that assess employment, programming, and service delivery and resource allocation. In January 2022, the group of us who've been working on the CEDAW work presented our draft to Mayor Sachi Rhodes Conway, She felt much of what the ordinance called for was already being done, but we continue to be in dialogue with her and her staff, as well as our sponsoring alder, Lindsay Lemmer, about next steps. Meanwhile, on November 14th, 2021, thanks to chapter board member Anita Pradam, Bandana Rana, vice chair of the UN Committee of 23 independent women's rights experts that work on implementing CEDAW and the 187 member states that have ratified it, was the keynote at UNA-Dane's annual celebration on the founding of the UN. Also in November 2021, as the world focuses attention on UN's climate change conference, COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, UNA-Dane, led by its affiliated Oregon, Wisconsin discussion group, working with Dane County Youth Environment Committee, created Glasgow to Dane County, a youth climate summit. More than 70 students from 18 Dane County high schools gathered at Oregon High School to discuss climate change and climate actions they could take. Discussions are underway to hold another student-moderated and co-sponsored climate action conference this fall. So clearly, we're already doing some really good work. I think that from these experiences, Mary and I are coming back energized. We have some new ideas, maybe some new information that can be shared, or maybe just and I think the other part of us as delegates is we get to go there and talk to other people about the great work that we're doing here, and we get to sort of say, hey, this is what we've done and how we've had successes. So it's really about that sharing of knowledge. So what can we expect for CSW 67? Well, the priority theme and review theme have been selected. So you can see here next year is innovation and technological change in education in the digital age for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And the review theme is challenges and opportunities in achieving gender equality and the empowerment of rural women and girls. In terms of things that are ahead of us, Mary and I would both like to really encourage any of you who have an interest in women's issues or either of these themes to consider pursuing delegate status next year. As much as I know Mary would love to go back next year, I don't know if they will break a rule another year in a row to let her go a third time. And I'm not the kind of person who pushes those kind of limits or rules, so I will not be applying for a few more years. But I know we have a lot of really talented people on the board and in our general UNA-Dane population and our greater Madison and Dane County community. If you want to join, obviously you have to be a UNA member to apply, but to go to those parallel events, you don't have to be a member of UNA USA, and you don't even have to be a member necessarily of those organizations. A lot of them you can register for as long as you have the link. So Mary and I would be happy to help people find that information for anyone who might be interested in attending any of those types of events. So that brings us to the end of our prepared comments, and I will do my best to answer questions. Recognize again, everybody, that I am not a women's historian, so I will do my best. And I haven't been following the chat, so I apologize if people have been chatting and I've been missing questions along the way. I don't see any chats, so any questions or comments? Oh, Erin, yeah, go ahead.
Wonderful job. Thank you so much for doing that, for sharing all of that. Do you feel that, or is there evidence of like solid action, policy and, things that take place as a direct result of this, of these 66 meetings? Could you, I'm sorry, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but I'm just wondering, is there like a place in the UNA site that talks about, this was started, et cetera?
Well, in terms of the UNA USA itself, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I know that the UNA website does have there's a UNA women's group. Mm-hmm. It's an affinity group. And so you can join that mailing list. And I know that there are some regional and national initiatives that are related to that. In terms of the headquarters, they have various like sort of fellowships, and you can, you know, apply for leadership positions within the organization. But I do think that since UNA itself is a much more grassroots organization, I think they're more interested in supporting the work that local chapters are doing. You know, so in some ways, I think that there might be like tools and things like that on their website. And for instance, a lot of the Cities for CEDAW is a separate group, but a lot of the materials we've got for the CEDAW work has been from Cities for CEDAW website, which, you know, kind of is peripheral to, but somewhat related to UNA. In terms of concrete actions from the UN itself, it's, you know, I think it's, I think the examples of the different kinds of meetings are really good example of the different speeds of action. So at the official plenaries, you have these canned statements. I think governments themselves move slowly because they're huge. They require a lot of moving parts to come together. And then you have that kind of middle ground that moves a little bit more faster, that's a little bit more risky, but they're not as swift as the grassroots stuff, but they're not as slow as the government stuff. And then where I think most of the action is happening is in individual nonprofits that are seeing a problem in their community or seeing a problem in another community and are applying time and effort and talent and resources to those issues in their communities or, you know, in global communities. So I think the majority of the action is really in those spaces. And that doesn't necessarily require CSW to happen. I think a lot of that would happen anyway, but I think CSW presents an opportunity for groups who have similar interests to come together and share. So when you're in those spaces and you're connecting with other groups and other people doing the work, you're like, wow, they did something that was really cool. Like we could do that here. You know, and I think, you know, there were a lot of university students that were there. And so I think sometimes universities have really great projects that are going on too. So I feel like, I hope that answers the question that you were asking, but I feel like it really depends on who's responsible in terms of where the real action is and how fast it goes.
Okay, thank you.
Debbie.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie. This was a brilliant presentation.
Well, you can thank Mary for that, really.
well, you're the one who I heard it from you. So between the two of you, I think it was really a brilliant presentation because you've kind of like provided us with a beautiful background about CSW itself, and then, you know, provided us with an overview of how you participated. And I'm very, very energized. I'm as energized as you, as if I was part of the delegation.
Next year.
Next year, yes.
Yes.
So I have more experience of participating in the CSW from the Global South. And I'm therefore really excited to see how much you know, how much you've shared. And one of the things I really want to understand, first of all, how long have you participated in the CSW as UNA-Dane County? And secondly, I'm also trying to understand how the CSW processes are being kind of implemented here in the USA, because really what happens, as you know, and as you've already shared, and I'll give you an example, because for most of us who've related to the CSW or participated from the Global South, there's a lot of organizing that has to be done. There's identification of the gaps at the country level as guided by the priority theme and the review theme. And so we usually, what we usually do is really understand and even contribute to the country reports that are submitted at the CSW. We kind of critique them as, you know, civil society and all that kind of thing. And there's a lot of negotiation that also happens within the countries and actually within the region. So for example, for the first time, there was a parallel African CSW that was convened around this CSW, thanks to technology. And so I really want to understand what is the advocacy agenda in the United States? What are the gaps? And therefore, how do we as civil society or all these other actors therefore rally around issues as guided by the themes, and therefore ensure that when the US government goes to CSW, we're actually part of the negotiation and we've informed whatever they're going to submit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think to go back to the first part of your question, so this was my first year attending CSW.
Oh, okay.
And I'm very, very new to women's issues. This is Mary's second year attending, and I've only been involved with UNA since 2020-ish. So there might be other people on this call who have a longer history. Does anyone know of anyone else besides Mary who's ever attended from UNA-Dane? Anyone have, Barb, do you know, or?
Well, I've gone, but not necessarily to, I've gone to the general meetings, but not to the CWAT meetings. So I think the question that she's asking is, it's best to try to reach out to the chapters in a region to see what they are doing. And different chapters have different levels of involvement. And I don't know what the level of involvement is in CEDAW in terms of the chapters in our region. That might be something that information that we could get from our regional director, or maybe it's maybe in the reports that come out, they identify the UNA chapters that have done specific work around CEDAW. It has to be somewhere, but I'm just not sure where it is. Is Mary on the call?
She's out.
I would, this is Linda.
Yeah.
I would add that just in my conversations with Mary and the city ordinances, that's one initiative a number of cities have taken in the US with their UNA chapters. And I think, I don't know how many, a handful.
I think it's like six.
Yes, around 6 have adopted the CEDAW principles in their city ordinances. And Madison is working on it.
And Debbie, to talk a little bit more about how can we impact the message that the United States is bringing forth. I don't have an official answer, but my sense is United Nations Association is one of around 6,000 NGOs that are able to send delegates. So we have a voice as a national, like as UNA USA national. And of course, having 2 delegates from the Dane County chapter, we have maybe a little bit of a bigger voice in that than other chapters do. But the reality is that the delegates like Mary and I don't get selected until a month or 2 before. So we don't really have any participation in terms of the message that's going forth. My guess is that the UNA USA headquarters has some folks who are doing more collaborating and advising. So for instance, one of the parallel events that I mentioned, the forever chemicals, the PFAS that had, for instance, London Bell, who's from the Detroit chapter. She's also the head of the Great Lakes and Great Lakes region and some of the part of some of the affinity groups. She's a national representative. So like United Nations Association has regional representatives that serve on the national. Right now, and that's separate from CSW specifically. That's just like in general, there are these folks who kind of are elected as representatives. There was actually just an election within the last week or 2. So I think in terms of getting our voices heard locally here, we would need to try to coach and advocate for somebody to get elected to one of those national positions, and then for them to collaborate more directly with CSW. But I also think, going back to what I was talking about before in terms of the statements that the United States or other countries prepare, that is somewhat guided by the work that we're all doing on the ground, but it's also very carefully constructed to cast them in a good light. And I also think that that's coming from those representatives, those very specific representatives. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was like 8 representatives from Western Europe and North America. So not even every year is there necessarily a person from the United States who's on the CSW representation. Only 45 members are selected for their 4-year terms, and that's constantly changing. So in terms of how people get selected for that, that's a specific UN thing. And I really have no idea about that. That kind of goes outside of the scope of UNA-USA. But I do think that the folks at the UNA-USA headquarters are really responsive to outreach. I've spoken with many of them. They get back to me by email quickly. They connect me with resources. So if you have more specific questions that you think they might be able to help, I'd be happy to share with you some contact information for you to follow up with those folks. And I also would be interested in hearing from you. You mentioned that you have more involvement with this from a Global South perspective. I would be interested too to hear, maybe we can connect offline so I can hear a little bit more about what that process looks like in some of those regions. So thank you so much. I hope that addressed as much of what you were looking for as I can share based on my limited participation. I see Sigrid. Got it. Sigrid, do you wanna, so Sigrid wrote in the chat that she attended CSW virtually. Do you want to comment on anything from that?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, like you said, that how many really small countries and developing countries were there representing gender equality, and how some of the bigger nations sent men to represent gender equality. I noticed that too, and I went last year, so I noticed that. I was like, wow, that's yeah. At least when it came to a lot of the sessions on trauma in women that I went to, luckily those presenters were pretty much all women, couple guys in there, but yeah, it sounds, yeah, gender violence just sounds very strange presented from a guy. It's as if white people, present about Black people, and it's just that same old, you should hear the voices of the people who are affected. The one thing that stuck out to me was when you said that the US and Europe aren't doing nearly as much as developing countries. First of all, I really think it's great what some of the tiny countries and countries without a lot of resources are doing. But then I'm always taken aback when in the sense of especially climate change, the US and Europe get mentioned in the same sentence, because there's such vast differences between what the US versus Europe are doing in that regard. And particularly I'm from Germany, and Germany's doing a ton. If you take a train ride through Germany, all electric trains, you will see that even the smallest of towns, the picturesque towns, all have solar panels on almost every house. And there's, wind farms everywhere, and offshore on the islands in the North Sea and all that. And gender equality, I think our top positions currently in our government are filled by a majority of women at this point. We've had a female chancellor who is the equivalent to our president, who has been in power for 20 years. So I think, and I see it through a German lens, but there's other countries in Europe that are doing similar things. So I remember from high school when we looked at our atlas, there was no online maps, nothing. So And we were looking at an energy map of the world, and the United States had their own color. Like they were in a category by themselves with the most energy usage per capita of anyone in the world. So at the time, I'm sure now China is probably up there and stuff too, but like at the time, the United States was alone in that category. And that left an impression even when I was like 17 and slightly disinterested in stuff like that, so yeah, those are kind of my things that stick out.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, I think that sometimes countries are unfairly lumped together. And I think in this situation, it kind of comes down upon like resource lines. Like I think they're lumped together based on resources, not necessarily on climate approach or to your point on women's issues, but yes, unfairly lumped together. But yeah, any additional?
Yeah, this is Barbara.
Oh, go ahead, Barb.
I would just like to remind folks of what our keynote speaker said, who was from Nepal, and the point she made is it's like throwing a pebble in the ocean and watching it ripple, and small steps become very relevant over time. And the point she made is just in Nepal, raising the issue for girls to go to school is a major undertaking. And they've had what we would call minimal steps, but for them, it's a huge cultural phenomenon based on how they view women and the role of women and the rights of women. So when you're in this space, I think you have to be able, as best you can, to look at it through the lens of difference, and not necessarily through the U.S. lens. And then the final thing I would say is I was the regional director for one term, and the regional directors make up the board for the United Nations Association at the national level. It's like any organization, the squeaky wheel gets the attention. And California and New York, in terms of their regional directors, because they have more chapters with larger members, tend to, at least when I was on the board, dominate the topics. So it's unless, and when I was on the board, the person you mentioned who's our regional director now was also on the board. She's been elected for quite a few times. I don't remember. At one time there was a limit on the number of terms you can serve. I don't remember now anymore, but in any event, she's a lawyer and she's been there in that role for a long time. And she's able, because of her law background, to get a voice in around the empowerment issues around women. So I think it's like, little drops of water, finally make an ocean, finally fill a pail. And one drop at a time by itself doesn't seem important, but it's the cumulative impact that makes a difference. And so this is a topic that is important, but it's not high on the priority list of things that UNA USA have. And I think from a woman's standpoint, we have to keep pushing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And to your point too, I think anytime you try to compare, to unlike things, you're just setting yourself up for failure. So I think that was a really important point. We can't compare different countries and different cultures because they are different. So that was really important. And then for those of you who are UNA members, I think many of you are, I'll just mention that one of our colleagues from Milwaukee is also running. So London Bell from Detroit is running again, and I'm forgetting the name. I think it's Sharon Collins from Milwaukee is running, and she's been really involved in the Milwaukee chapter. So vote for both of those two if you haven't already. They're both really powerful voices in the region for UNA.
Well, are they running against each other, or do we have two
No.
seats?
I think they're running for different seats. I'd have to go back to the ballot and look if I can even look at it again, but they're running for different things. Yeah. Yep. Debbie.
Yes, just a quick one. I just wanted to speak to the issue of male participation.
Mm-hmm.
There's a growing movement, and I'm one of those women who is very supportive of building a critical mass of male champions for gender equality. When I joined the what I call the women's rights movement and the gender movement, like 20 years ago as a young woman, we kind of used yes, we were feminists, yes, but I do believe that we can have male feminists, if there's something like that, you know?
Yeah.
And this was based on my personal experience as a survivor of so much. And I reflected on the men in my life, the men and the boys in my life. And yes, whilst some of them were abusive, but there were so many enablers, and still are so many male enablers in my life who actually have joined us as male champions for gender equality. So we're treading that fine line where we do have the genuine male champions, but then there's also the politics, you know, in this thing, especially from the global South. You find that some of these leaders, the delegations comprise of the politically correct kind of people, but there is an increasing number of male champions out there. I just wanted to throw this in as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think I was in a different meeting today. It was a meeting about a social justice type meeting, and it was really along those same lines. Like, when, you know, if we don't have men who are participating in women's rights issues, if we don't have white people participating in racial issues, it's when those people realize that their liberation and their humanity depends on recognizing everyone else as equals and as humans and whatever, you know, then, you know, that's when we can make some real progress. So I think that's a really great point, that, you know, obviously all voices need to be a part of this. If only women are doing this work, then we're missing out on a huge chunk of people. So that's such an important point. And yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the differences between, you know, the people who are talking a good game and the people who are actually, the men, I should say, the men who are just talking a good game versus the men who are really doing this work and doing it really well. So I think, you know, in this kind of, you know, at a CSW kind of environment where I think those of us who are delegates are there as observers, it's really hard to maybe discern that or to tease that out. But I think when you're working in the more, in the smaller organizations, that's where you can have those more, you can have those relationships where you can really find who those champions are and find ways for them to mobilize members of their own communities to support the causes. So thank you so much for bringing that forward. Any other thoughts? Any other questions?
So Stephanie, one thing that really stood out to me when you were talking about different countries, you know, some countries have honor culture, and you know that, you know, they are just making it look like they're so progressive. And then there are other countries where there may be a lot of good work in progress, but, you know, they're too hard on themselves. And again, that's where our PhD international psychology training comes back, because I am a first generation immigrant from India, where there's an honor culture, you know. And when I was in med school in India, it was like, wow, we are a government college, we are providing care to poor for free. And now I come to USA as a Master's of Health Administration student, And my professors are always beating up the healthcare systems of the US because US is a dignity culture. So I really appreciate your insights and how that made you realize that, you appreciate authenticity, but some cultures are more about saving face. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that whenever you're in these kinds of global spaces and global conversations, it's like I have to constantly remind myself, you have a very specific worldview, you have a very specific cultural lens, and how is that impacting, how are you filtering things through that lens? So that's why I think that these opportunities to discuss, especially globally, are so helpful, because then I can hear about other people's perspectives as well. So absolutely. Thanks, Gunjan.
I think that was my happiest moment at the last year's conference, that the breakout room I ended up in with a lady from, I think it was Trinidad and Tobago, a lady from North Macedonia, a lady from Ireland, and myself. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is what UN means to me, that we can come together in a Zoom room from all over the world and discuss the issues with our cultural perspectives all there. So that was amazing.
Great comments, great insight.
Thank you so much. So who wants to go next year? Who is a UNA-Dane team for CSW67? Yeah, okay, I see an Aaron, maybe, yeah, Sigrid, maybe, and I see a Debbie, yes, all right, we've got we've got a crew, yeah. Well, and again, there's always, of course, I think everyone should apply as official delegates, but there's also those opportunities to attend in an unofficial capacity as well. So I think that's another really great opportunity to be able to attend those parallel events. I don't have any sort of indication in terms of whether things will be virtual or in person or hybrid, but we'll have to stay tuned for that. But the great news is, and I will go back, I don't have my slides showing anymore, but I will go back. The theme, just as a reminder for next year, innovation and technological change and education in the digital age for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. So we can be thinking about that as a UNA-Dane or in our other organizations that we're a part of, in terms of, what thoughts do we have on that topic and what do we bring to that? And then that review theme, I think, is also really interesting in the context, maybe not as much Dane County, but in Wisconsin, challenges and opportunities in achieving gender equality and the empowerment of rural women and girls. So another really important conversation that we can be engaging in as we go. Another thing I will mention is that I don't know the process by which we're able to present, for example, at those parallel events, but I do think that Mary might have some ideas. So if there were folks from UNA, Dane County, or UNA in general who wanted to put together a parallel event, I do think that we have that capacity. So, and I think that partnerships are always a great opportunity. So whether it's with 4W at UW or whether it's with other organizations or institutions, I think there's a lot of great potential for that. And I think that that's a way for us to bring our little slice of the world to the rest of the world so that they can understand the issues that we're facing and how we're addressing them, and to be able to get that insight from other places that might have really innovative strategies to help us tackle some of the challenges that we do have.
I guess just one point I would like to make, and that is participation. This is my observation. I don't know its universality, but my observation is in our chapter, money is the issue, because we do not have funds to support people attending these meetings. So we have all we can do to cobble together to pay. We're just now at the point where we can pay the expenses for the president to attend the annual leadership meeting. And for example, when I was president, I paid my own way. I mean, I got $250 and what that paid for, it paid for. It didn't even pay for the registration. So our problem as a small chapter is, one, the interested party / delegate must pay their own way. which means transportation, accommodations, and food, and then either take time off from work or use their personal vacation. So it becomes more difficult for people to want to use. I'm not saying they don't have the money, but they choose not to use their money that way. You know, their preference is maybe their own personal vacation or doing things with their family members or doing something else. So what we compete with is, because we're a small chapter and we are unable to fund a piece, a bit, interest wanes in that regard. And so my observation is, if we have people who are interested in participating in these meetings, like we know it's a year away from now. If there are people who are interested, we need to have a layaway plan. You know, where we put that we put money away and save it for that event. You know, that kind of thing.
Well, I think what I think is interesting is that although you lose the pizzazz of being there in New York at the UN building and such, that the virtual event expanded the number of people that could participate.
True.
And I wonder if that isn't going to be some expectation for the future, even if there is also an in-person meeting. And, you know, I certainly, as president of UNA-Dane, feel the disconnect of not having any presence with people, with the annual meetings in Washington and New York. But it does also really expand participation. So it's going to be an interesting, it'd be interesting to see how next year's meeting is planned.
I also think that, you know, knowing this far in advance, that gives us a great opportunity to look for grants and to see if we can, you know, write for some grants, or if we can try to, you know, see if UW has any money for this kind of stuff, or even maybe the city of Madison or Dane County. I mean, we have a lot of folks who are connected in a lot of different ways. And so, yes, maybe we can make up some of it from our own pocket and from the organization and from these other entities. So I think there's, we know it's a year away. So we've got, 11 and a half months or so to try to stow that money away, to Barb's point, or to try to see who's willing to give us some money.
Yes,
so.
great. That's a great idea. Great.
I mean,
idea.
with that topic, I right now feel like I want to hit up Epic for some funding for that kind of thing. You know what I mean?
That's a good point. Yeah,
I was started by a woman in technology. So,
right.
Yep. And even, I mean, maybe even, I know it's different, but even people maybe like Mary Burke at Trek and some other, there might be some other folks who are kind of, who have some alignment with some of these topics. So lots of great stuff to think about. And I look forward to reconnecting with Mary when she's feeling better. I think she'll be so excited about the enthusiasm that so many of you have about this topic. And I think especially with her history and her background and connections, she might have some thoughts too about where we can find some, if not financial support, even just organizational sort of support or visibility support. So I will definitely take that back to her and see what she thinks. Anything else?
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation and discussion on this topic, and CSW66. And you were great flexible. You're greatly flexible in presenting under the circumstances. And I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight for a really very interesting and critically important topic.
Thanks so much for having me. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah.
Thank you.